Welcome to the 62nd of the invited series of registered talks here at the Kingston School of Art. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Andrew Plancy. I'm the Professor of Architecture here. We might just do, I think you all know probably that our very esteemed and very dear Head of Department, Mary Vaughan Johnson, died suddenly about 10 days ago. And what I thought might be a good way to start this talk was if we could just take a minute of silence. For those of you who don't know Mary, she was a kind of very warm, a very extraordinary person who really transformed a lot of people's attitudes towards education in our department, but also was a very collegiate and very engaged part of the team. So I think what I'd just like to do is to take 1 minute now of silence to mark her very sad passing. So thank you very much. Mary was, she was actually good with silence. She knew how to be silent and let others to fill the space sometimes, and she knew how to speak to fill that space at other times. So she was, she might smile at us gathered in silence in her memory. And then on to the business of this evening. We have an invited lecture series where we get thinkers and leading practitioners from around the world to speak. For the last 12 months, we've been doing them virtually, as you can imagine, as everybody else has. Tonight, we're going to be joined by Eelco Hooftman, who I'll introduce in a minute. Next week, next week in the early morning at 9:30, we're going to be joined by Kate Goodwin, who's joining us from Australia, and she's the outgoing curator of architecture at the Royal Academy, and she'll be talking to us about exhibiting landscape and exhibiting architecture in those formats. But tonight, we're joined by a landscape architect, and I think it's worth saying that we're one of the few schools of architecture and landscape that are conjoined in a single department in the UK, and we really value this relationship. I think that landscape has so much to teach architecture, not least on the level that, like, I'm always continually blown away by is how landscape architects think in terms of scale, and I mean scale in terms of time, but also physical scale, and also scale in terms of the increment about how a project can be delivered. There's also this kind of fundamental thing about landscape as a sensibility, which is that in a different position to, oh sorry, can everybody mute for 1 second? Sorry, just some background noise coming in. Yeah, that landscape has obviously always been territorial, always engaged with the places where it's working in a very deep way, which is something that architecture, to be slightly reductive about, did spend much of the 20th century seeking to resist and to seek to find other unified ways of engaging with territory. And I'm just wondering whether I could ask Christoph Fatzer, who's the head of our landscape courses here in Kingston, maybe to unmute and maybe welcome Eelco and his practice and to launch the lecture. So Christoph, are you there?
Yes, I am. Hello.
Hello, Christoph.
Hi, good evening. Hello. Hello, Eelco. Very welcome to the Kingston Register Lecture Series. And when we discussed who to invite with Enrico Evangelisti, who happened to be actually a Harvard graduate, although I just learned today that you haven't taught him, so don't feel embarrassed if you don't know the name. And but it was yeah, you have been there already when he studied there, and who is also with us tonight. So when we discussed it, Grossmax came up, of course, on, yeah, one of the first names, And I'm very happy because when I was article editor at the Journal of Landscape Architecture, the company's name always came as a very important reference point. And I feel very privileged that we can welcome you here, and very much looking forward to your lecture. Thank you.
I will try to share screen and see if that all works out. Do you see my screen?
Yeah, perfectly.
That's great. Okay, and then I will start.
Perfect.
Yeah, sorry to speak to you guys in those circumstances. And so my heartfelt condolences with Mary Johnson passing. And maybe it will make my talk a bit more reflective, because, you know, it's not always about boosting and shouting and crying for attention. Sometimes it's also important to talk about, you know, the more meaningful things behind what we do. And I think that Mary Johnson was doing with you guys, of course, was the importance of teaching. And as being mentioned, I've been teaching for 9 years in Harvard. Before that, I was teaching for 16 years at the School of Art in Edinburgh. And I think teaching is always part of also my practice. If somebody asks, you know, what have you achieved in your profession, I think I've probably achieved more in teaching than in practicing. But okay, so let's give it a shot. And by the way, Andrew, who introduced me as well as an architect, he kind of give away all the tricks of the landscape architect. He talked about the scale and the time scale, and so I put them here together for you. On the left, Mr. Highlord, the architect, and on the right, me, myself, or my profession, represented by the gardener. And yes, it's a world of difference, of course, although we are strange bedfellows, and we are very fond, I always call myself a closet architect. But there are differences. Landscape architects are slightly more down to earth, slightly more philosophical, and thinking about space and time as a very slow process of transformation. Now, we all know this beautiful diagram by the late Charles Jenks, who probably his achievement was indeed this one diagram, which he kind of nearly like a crossword puzzle went to the architectural history and confined all those different styles and approaches. And, you know, where is landscape? Somebody asked where are the women, because there's hardly any woman here, which Mary Johnson would not be pretty pleased about. But I'm more interested, what about the landscape architects? And suddenly, after a while of pondering this, I got it. I think the black holes in these diagrams are the kind of missing links of the landscape architects. So that is what we try to fill in today for you. And of course, it's always good to think local. And you guys being in Kingston, you should know this guy, Alexander Pope, who was basically living across the river from where you guys are, where he had this beautiful garden and this beautiful grotto with a kind of camera obscura observing the River Thames. And he, of course, he was a poet, but he wrote about the genius loci and the genius of place. And quite frankly, that has been the stronghold of my profession for many generations now, regardless any styles. It is about the genius of the place. It's unraveling the sense of place. However, I sometimes think that we're now living in a different era. And so I kind of updated the idea of genius loci and trying to talk about ingenious loci. So we have to be, you know, where is the genius if there is no place? And many of our projects are about non-places, about the in-between, the Zwischenstadt, or the kind of, the terra rasa. So we have to think about the ingenious loci, how we can be inventive and create our own genius. And part of landscape, it's not only about skill and the territory, but it's also about the senses. I think our profession is really about the senses, the realm of the senses, and being overwhelmed by not only the visual, but also the smell and the whole entourage of being in landscape. And these are two other of my heroes. You could say on the left hand Bacchus and on the right Apollo. And Bacchus maybe stands for hedonism and being extrovert and being in the heat of the party, in the heat of the moment. It's about ecstasy. And Apollo stands more for rigor, structure, architecture. And I think landscape architecture can combine those two opposites, can reconcile the romantic with the classic. And these are, again, two images I like. On the left hand, Manet with the famous picnic. And on the right hand side, it's actually Germany, of all places. It's Munich, which is hardcore conservative, but give them a piece of nature, in this case, the English Garten in Germany. And all hell breaks loose, you know, and I like that. So also in landscape, you know, or professionally, having this longing for paradise, we this kind of the ur natur, the back to the origin. In the work of Grossmax, my practice, which I started with Bridget Baines back in 1996, the idea of making images is very important, and I always say that even more than architecture or profession links to the world of painting, to the visual world of how to depict the landscape. Even the word landscape actually comes from the Dutch word landscape, which was painting the landscape in the 17th century. But we like to use our images not just as after images after the project, not like the architectural rendering, but it's about the in-between, the image as speculation, the image as manifesto. So many of our work is making this journey of the visual exploration of the product. Often this comes long before we even start to consider how the product looks on plan. And often these images are made in the very early stage of a product. They become the kind of program to work towards. This is a project we built in London, a vertical garden with the artist Mark Dion. A very old project in the city of Rotterdam. But we're liking this idea of being the sublime, being overwhelmed by nature, and the idea that landscape is a journey through space and time. It's actually very cinematic. A lot of, I mean, I talked about painting, but actually a lot of the references I normally make it brings us back to the world of film and filmmaking. So I just go a bit quick to this idea, and this is actually, again, very close to you guys. We made at once 10 years ago a landscape master plan for Kew Garden. The whole idea was to opening up Kew back to the river, which kind of turns it back to the river. And with this kind of vision, we kind of, although we were at that time a very small practice, we kind of convinced the curator of the gardens that we had something to bring on the table. And sometimes our work are more art and art installations. This is an art commission we got in the city of Glasgow, this kind of strange, mysterious glass house, a garden for an art lover, it's called. And a recent project we built in China, this kind of folly as part of an horticultural expo. And a park right now on site in the city of Beijing in China. So yes, all those ideas is the idea of the playing with light, playing with atmospheres, playing with the ambience as part of drawing people into our projects, and competition be done in the gardens of Versailles on this particular image. So yes, we very much not only interested in the arts, but also in the science. In fact, on the left-hand side is a 19th century device, a scientific device to mark the color of the sky. It's a very beautiful circle of bluish colors. And on the right is a little sketchbook of Gilpin, the guy who wrote a lot about the theory of landscape in the 18th century. And yes, it's about the overlap between science and art, and because it's all about the visual exploration. And I talked already about cinema. On the left-hand side, the Draftsman Contract. It's the film, if you don't have seen it, a fantastic film about somebody who makes a measured drawing of a garden. And on the right, my favorite film, Blown Up by Antonioni, in which it's all about a mystery which has taken place, and it has to be a photograph has to be blown up to unravel the mystery. But this is also, it's about framing, it's about being microscopic and being telescopic. It's about zooming in and zooming out. And it's quite an interesting quote of Werner Herzog, the filmmaker, who wrote this fantastic book, Guide to the Perplexed, which is a beautiful title for any book, especially for us architects and landscape architects. And what I like about Werner Herzog, as well as Antonioni and some of the other filmmakers, is that the landscapes is not just the backdrop, but it actually becomes a character. It becomes one of the plates in its own right. And I like this statement of Werner Herzog when he says that he actually directs landscapes like he can direct actors and animals as well. Another of my heroes, and I will take you on a little journey out of lockdown, on a little exotic journey with Charles Darwin. And I want to talk about a kind of secretive project which not many people know or will think about Charles Darwin and this project, but it's a fantastic project in which he undertook in conjunction with Joseph Hooker, who was the curator at Kew Gardens in the same, we're talking about the 1850s. And Hooker and Darwin did build a project together, and they built this project together on this island, the Ascension Island. This island is in the middle of nowhere between South America and Africa, and actually geographically very strategic in the kind of British naval empire, colonial empire. But when Darwin visited this island as part of his 5-year Beagle tour, the island was completely barren. There was no vegetation and there was no access to sweet water. So Darwin came up with a cunning plan. He found a friend or whatever, wrote to his friend Joseph Hooker, and they made up the plan to replant the island and to replant the top of the extinct volcano on this island. And by doing so, the trees had to be collected from anywhere where they could get their hands on. They came from South America, they came from Africa, they even came from Kew Gardens themselves, all shipped to this island, all mixed up, creating a completely artificial ecosystem. And what happens with that ecosystem is that the green on top of the extinct volcano started to gather the clouds, and on top of the volcano, a dew pond was being created, the clouds starting to drop the rain, and suddenly access to sweet water was made assured. And this is still there, this green island, and a fantastic experiment. And I love it because it shows that nature can be created. Nature can be a man-made product, and nature can be inventive. Nature can be ingenious, and therefore ingenious loci. Probably Darwin and Hooker are the first ingenious loci product in that sense. And somebody of my office, David Richard, he actually went. He had to go there with military plane, and he went to this island and he documented this dew pond. So yes, we like the idea of what we call nature activation. So I hate the idea of nature conservation. That's the kiss of death. Nature cannot be conserved. Nature is on the loose. Nature is always on the move, and we can activate nature. And hence again on the left, Albrecht Dürer, the famous painting. 1500 of a piece of turf, and then Grossmax on the right started to intensify that with this idea of nature activation. Now this is what we do in real life as well, and sometimes on the big scale. We, again, quite strange that we as a small company were engaged at the expansion of Heathrow Airport, the new runway. And I know it's a controversial product, and you could argue, shall we work on airports? However, I do a lot of travel, so I would be hypocrite not to work on airports. But we always want to give it a twist. And when we applied for the job, we said, all right, Heathrow, it's a Heath. It used to be Heath. That's in the name. Can we make the airport back into a heath? And can we absorb the airport back into nature? And now that's not totally going to happen according to plan, but as a result of all the thinking and the idea that the airport should become the most sustainable hub airport, we actually doing serious work and serious research with serious trial plots to have special species of grass which have a very thick root mass, really incredible thick roots, and those roots absorb carbon out of the air. This grass absorbs much more carbon than a forest ever could do in its own right. So the whole idea is the airport in itself becomes a carbon sink. Now that's of course only one aspect of many aspects to try to make a sustainable airport. And other projects which brings us in different places. We recently were invited with 3 other teams to compete for the landscape around the Eiffel Tower. And I don't know if you know the mayor of Paris is a woman, Delgado, and she is really hot on ecology and sustainability and try to work in the ethos of the Paris Climate Agreement, of course. And really started to make a change. And so all those historic landscapes, including this visitor hotspot, will be transformed in a kind of much more ecological, hydrological, water recycling type of landscape. Now we lost this competition. We lost against Gustafsson, also based in London. They're very good, so that's fine. But it shows you the idea of the transformation of our cities, not only in new products, but also revisiting historic products and try to give them a new lease of life based on ecology, biodiversity, and water recycling and water purification. And also making those gardens more part of the local community. So it's a part of this project was also to re-engage the local Parisians back in the gardens, and hence those community gardens and productive gardens and cafe restaurants, all part of that world of the more local culture. So very quickly, I don't have time to go to all those build projects. I actually show you more of the speculative unbuilt projects. So to show you that we build projects, some small examples. This is started off as a temporary garden in Glasgow, in which we kind of demolished a hospital in order to create a landscape. Now that's felt a bit like sweet revenge, because normally architects destroy a piece of landscape to build a building. So we were asked to destroy a building in order to create a piece of landscape, and that felt quite a nice way, the other way around for once. A lot of the work is hard landscape combined with soft. In London, we worked for quite a lot of projects along the River Thames, not only Kew Gardens, also this South Bank, the Royal Festival Hall, the National Theatre. Those landscapes are Grossmax pieces, as well as Pottersfield Park, together with the plantsman Piet Oudorff, next to the Tower Bridge and the London headquarters. So yes, we do a lot of hard landscapes, Winterus Square on the right and the Bull Ring on the left in Birmingham. Right, now and project in slightly more details. We recently, and we actually still working on some projects along the Wembley National Stadium, and one of the projects is the kind of processional avenue from the tube station all the way down north-south towards the stadium. And when we started to analyze this, we always like to put things in the bigger picture. It was quite interesting actually that this processional axis of the Wembley Stadium is orientated on Barn Hill and actually got a kind of anchoring point in the landscape as well. Also, we discovered that Wembley Park, as it is called, it's the reason why it's called Park, because it was actually a romantic garden designed by Repton. And again, so all kind of, if you go into a project, you find always little moments. But how to create an avenue and not being boring and not being a kind of Parisian type of boulevard in the middle of London. So we wanted to give it a twist. And in this case, we came up with the idea that this long processional route of trees are actually composed of pairs. Of each pair is a different species. So in total, we have about 36 different species of trees in this one avenue. And what we've done here is actually a little trick. What we've done here is we literally took a geographical section to the globe, to the world, And we're going from the east coast of America to the west coast. We're going to Europe, to Middle Europe, to Russia, China, and we end up in Japan. And that all those trees coming from those different temperate climatic zones are represented in this one long section. Okay, here we started to build the product, and here you see one or two images of the actual built thing. So it's a kind of quite interesting thing, because we've got so many different trees, which is actually quite an interesting kind of testing how those trees will react in climate change, and which trees would be the winners of the future, so the new trees to consider in this urban climate. So this is just an example of a little experiment of plants. In fact, we work closely with the curator of the Arboretum of Kew Gardens in advising us on what would be good trees to consider. And this is more for the architects in the audience, but to create this kind of landscape is infrastructure. It's a real, all the work sits under the ground in creating the right conditions to create those. If you want to have majestic trees, you have to, each tree needs 36 cubic meter of soil, and it needs water, and the green, sustainable urban drainage all being part of this aeration, etc. So there's a whole world out there. This is like, this is like a building under the ground in order to create some of those trees above ground. Another project we have been working on in London over recent years is on the Greenwich Peninsula. And that is, of course, it's about 68 hectares of new urbanism built around the dome and the transport interchange. Now, you can be slightly cynical about those projects, because it's true. If you talked to me 5 years ago, 10 years ago, all our work was public commissioned. So we were working for boroughs, we were working for councils, we were working for, for the public sector. And now nearly all we do by default is the private sector, even if it's public landscape. So I just put this on the table. There's a reality which we have to work with, which is not always bad, because sometimes the private sector sees landscape in a certain way as a commodity, which allow us to go the extra mile and do maybe things we couldn't do in the past. But yeah, so here we got a whole part of London being built, in fact, by one developer, in this case, Knight Drucken from Hong Kong. But good for us is that we work on the master plan, we work on the redesign of the park, we work on the waterfront. So we're having a kind of continuous dialogue over a prolonged period of time in this particular project. And one of the odd things we're doing in this project is building this kind of loop, which is now called the Tide. It started, originally was called the P5K, but it's a kind of strange, ambiguous route, which is a running track, walkway, partly raised in the sky, partly elevated across the river. It's a kind of odd one out, which kind of winds its way to the urban fabric. And I'm going to show you some of the first installment of that project. And that first installment was a collaboration with Diller Scofidio, who also done the High Line, and AKT, the engineer. So it was a really true collaboration where the boundaries between architecture, landscape, and engineering started to disappear. And again, here we see the first of our drawings of expressing this kind of raised park in the sky, this kind of raised walkway. And then some of the images, and then obviously building the product. And it's kind of slightly weird animal weaving its way to the urban fabric. And obviously this was just before COVID, so we haven't been back recently, but it will be interesting in a way how people started to interact and occupy those spaces and see if they work as a kind of new hybrid public realm. So quickly, some of the projects, and again, quite complicated to build those raised landscapes, obviously, and to build this whole structure which sits right bang on the underground system below. So it's hellishly underground car parks, ventilations, all the issues. So hence, like some of those electricity stations, substations, all kind of being I wouldn't say disguised, but kind of integrated into the overall play of the environment. And then odd one out, that's this Damien Hirst, rather grotesque. Actually, Damien Hirst, his first studio was on granite, so that's the reason why some of the client invited him to install some of his pieces along the waterfront. Okay, so that's a kind of landscape which is sitting in between the different categories. And then the actual water. The whole idea is that this is, you know, like a chapter in the book. So the next chapter will be written, and then the whole kind of figure eight will be installed over the coming years. Now, this is a completely different project. This is an art commission which we got together with the plantsman Piet Oudorf. And this project, Amsterkunst in Germany, in Bottrop, it was quite interesting because this was a project in which we were asked, actually for the first time, to find our own site. So this was a project in which we were commissioned, but without a site. So we could look in this kind of post-industrial landscape between motorways and railways and canals, really weird landscape. We were asked, all right, tell me what you like to do. And then we found this beautiful redundant waterworks. There's 2 circuits in the middle of this area photographs. And we said, wow, can we make this into a product? And they said, yes, you can. So, and part of the reason why we selected this project is that it could be not just an installation, it could become a real neighborhood park. It really had the right location to become, to be used as a park for the local community. But we also like this product. The 2 circles is of course a very old motif in my profession of landscaping. For example, the Renaissance gardens often also related to the cartography, the terrestrial map and the celestial map, you know, the way how that was being drawn. So we were interested in talking about the earth and talking about the sky, although the sky is represented on the right by a water garden, the reflections, and then the sunken earth garden. And that became the beginning of this kind of project in which we literally working with the existing situation and weaving the landscape into creating this kind of immersive experience. If you descend in this garden, you suddenly are away from it all. And the raised walkway you see on the right hand top, it's part of the mechanism of cleaning the original water. So we kind of working with what's there into this landscape. And then this kind of more reflective, serene water garden. So this is just an example of many projects actually in our portfolio where we're working on former industrial sites and we're kind of recycling sites into a new lease of life. And a good example of that same, but on a slightly bigger scale, is a project Grossmax is doing right now in Budapest in Hungary. It's a transport museum. And this was a big competition about 2 years ago. We won this competition together with Diller Scofidio Renfro. And now it's a live product. So, you know, this is, you know, most of my time in this particular period I spent on working on this project in Budapest. And this is sublime. If you did this transport museum sits in this old industrial sheds which were used for making and repairing trains. It's really a most sublime space you can imagine, and that sublime world sits in a rather weird, slightly ad hoc landscape of kind of spontaneous vegetation along those railway lines. So really quite a great starting point to think about how to think inside, outside, and together with Diller Scofidio, we're really working together, truly together, on an integrative approach to all of this. And of course, we are very interested in how those railway lines emerge into this center of former industrial activity, and actually brings nature into the site and links to the hinterland. And I will show you some more of that in a minute. And these are some of our drawings. We started to insert the kind of landscape as an event landscape and a museum landscape, but still very much in a sort of kind of low key as well in terms of the typology of the planting. But obviously all kind of things happening here. And it's not just a museum landscape. We're also designing just off the drawing a new railway station, and most of the landscape is public landscape. So it's actually a public park as well as a museum garden. And here we are interested in this idea of technical revolution and biological evolution, and this kind of the idea of a site as a palimpsest of time. But we're also interested in the idea, right, is transport, but transport is all about energy, and energy is all about the sun, and it's also about the new transport for the future is about new sources of energy. So the landscape also thematically is integral part of the display, and it's not just a backdrop, it's part of really talking about the issue of transport both in the past and in the future. And then this strange juxtaposition of nature and the industry, and this kind of part of the site literally will be left on its own, so it will be overgrown. And then we did an endless study about how this kind of network, spider network of railway lines leads to Budapest, and there's an incredible amount of lengths. But it's kind of it cut and connects a fantastic diversity of habitats and ecosystems. So we've done a very forensic study about all of this, and this Central Europe got the most fantastic wildflower meadows you can imagine, and all of that becomes the inspiration of bringing that in our fantasy from those railway lines. Those seeds will be transported to our site and starting to emerge in this new landscape. So some of the drawings of that, and again, it's an evolving landscape. If we do projects like this, we work quite a lot at the moment abroad. We tend to use local landscape architects to find collaborations with. So it's we taking the hat on the concept design, and we then supervising it, but working together with local, and in this case also local ecologists and plants people. So all kind of interesting things to make this into a kind of integrated experience. And then the planting, a lot of, we talked about botanic gardens and we talked about plants, but the new plants are actually the weeds and the illegal immigrants, and plants will be on the move because of climate change. Until recently, everybody talks about native trees and native plants, but nothing is native anymore. If climate is changing, everything will be on the move. And that's interesting. So can we create conditions and literally preparing the ground so it can be occupied and colonized by more spontaneous, sometimes even opportunistic type of vegetation? And we found that very intriguing. And we also like the debate, even the words plants as immigrants and plants as refuse and creating ecological refuse in our cities. So the whole idea of rural plants, the rubble plants growing on rubble, we think that that's the new ecology, that's the new nature. And that mixed with, of course, plants being used as crops, and plants are used as other ways to make a product is interesting. And a lot of that relates to preparing the soil and soil conditions. So, for example, when we look to the bigger map of Hungary on plan, we started to analyze all the different soils in relationship to the different habitats, and bringing in different soils, literally by preparing the ground, then the ground can be occupied by different vegetation. That's so the project will be also evolving over time. It will be a process instead of an object. Now, the last project I show you, it's It's a project actually in my home country. I'm originally from the Netherlands, and this project is about a mountain in the Netherlands. So that's a bit of a paradox, because there are no mountains. There's only one mountain, and this is the mountain in this project. And this is the site. It's a sublime site, and it is an old, well, it started off as an old mining site. So in the middle background, you see a black heap of spoil heap of former mining industry that all collapsed in the 1960s. And then they discovered another way of quarrying, and that was sand, the white sand. Now you think sand is sand, but in this case the sand is a very rare mineral, because this particular sand doesn't got any iron oxide in it, and can be used for very high-tech industries, like in your mobile phone or in your cars, and all kind of high-tech use. So it's a very expensive mineral. So that is being quarried here as well. And because of the white sand and quarrying in the depths, you reach the groundwater, you get this really light blue, mysterious reflective pools, and then the contrast between the black coal heap and the white sand. So that was our product, and thinking about this in a bigger context. And what was interesting is that this mountain we have, this spoil heap, had to be relocated. It's unheard. So for once we have a mountain in Holland, and then the story is, can we put the mountain from here to there? So the mountain has to move in order to dig more sand below that existing mountain of spoil heap. So the project is actually about removing, rebuilding a mountain, and that is of course super weird, and especially in the Dutch context. And we made that when we were asked to do the project, we were asked to do some small interventions in the landscape. But when we got the project, they said, no, we want to talk about the mountain. We want to redesign the mountain. And within the mountain, we want to make a museum. And it's not just a museum about mining, it's a museum about the Anthropocene, talking about the Anthropocene and the first museum of the Anthropocene. And then we not only want to talk about nature, we want to make this big strip of an enterprise zone. I will talk about that a bit more in a minute. So it became a kind of couple of 100 hectares of intervention. And here a bit this pictures we took about the spoil heap, with the spontaneous birds, vegetation, the shifting of the sand, the mining of the sand, a fantastic landscape. And this is Dutch, bergen verzetten, which means moving mountains. And that became the project. And we started to redesign a mountain with embedded in this mountain, the Museum of the Anthropocene. And what was interesting, and nobody actually knew about it before we started the project, but we discovered that this original mountain of spoil heap was actually designed by landscape architects in the 1930s. So it was already a landscape project, one of the first big, large-scale land regeneration projects in the Netherlands. So it also had a kind of cultural value, and it's fantastic that the original designers even talked about the pyramids in Egypt as a kind of reference in the way how the spoil heaps were designed in the landscape. So inspired by this, we started to design our own mountain, and as part of that, the mining and the mining history and the politicians bought into this program. So that was very interesting that the brief was not about designing a museum, but when we talked about this museum, all the politicians thought it was a great idea. So we created our own piece of architecture embedded in our landscape. So some of the images, and because it's a spoil heap and you got silver and you got pollution, we need to have an intricate system of water purification to deal with the drainage, etc. So quite a complex technical, quite a complex project, but that makes the beauty of designing this as a kind of working landscape. And then we also had the issue about the existing mountain, which had all those spontaneous trees, which we started to move. So I don't know if you know the paragraph in Macbeth, in Shakespeare, when there's a moving forest. And inspired by Shakespeare, we literally started to make a moving forest. We started to dig up this spontaneous woodland and put it elsewhere. So this became suddenly a very big project. It started as a small arty installation and became this huge, totally regenerating the landscape on a massive scale. And of course, part of in-depth ecological forensic exercise, hundreds and hundreds of spontaneous vegetation on this artificial spoil heap. We collected seeds, or will collect the seeds, to be reutilized in this project. Okay, and then some images of the our ideas. We're not architects, but we like to think spatially. So we created this dark bunker embedded in the spoil heap with some shafts of light as a flexible museum space. And from there you got this long, couple of 100 meter slot window overlooking the landscape. And then all references to the fossils found on the site, which shows this Carboniferous landscape, which used to be here in the first place in order to create the coal which was being mined. So, and then we found out that these are all parts of fossils found on the site and being used to write the first flora of this particularly time. So the Carboniferous forest, and then the next idea was, could we build the Carboniferous forest? Could we create the forest which created coal in the first place? Now, obviously, most plant species are gone, but some are still there, like the horsetail. So we started to make this idea of making a Carboniferous woodland as a kind of strange, poetic piece of landscape. Some of the models. And then what we call the Silica Valley. Silica, of course, not silicon, but silica from the sand. Silica, the enterprise zone where the old mine shafts used to be. We discovered that these shafts go 500 meters deep. You got very hot groundwater. We can pump that up. We have a fantastic source of energy to heat up, combined with solar heat and other alternative energies, to create this this kind of strange, couple of miles long enterprise zone for new industries and a new school of art, and all kind of things would be embedded in this natural landscape. And of course, inspired by Super Studio and R.G. Graham and the history of the site, we created this fantastic, weird zone of activities embedded in the landscape. But it's a kind of example of a project which we literally were on the roll. We created our own brief, we created our own interest, and something we started small became much bigger. At the time I was teaching in Harvard, and we used some of the equipment, fantastic equipment, in which we could test sedimentation. So we wanted to make a sedimentation garden out of all the silica sand as a kind of big land art installation, reutilizing some of the old equipment. And we started to experiment this in a kind of live 3D model in a way. And I think this tiny animation is not super exciting, but the idea that this could become this weird moving landscape, really dealing with the materiality of the minerals and the natural resources. And then finally, on the left-hand side is the logo of the client, which was the Dutch Nature Monuments. They were the client for this project, and the sign says Nature Monuments protect nature in the Netherlands. And we said, well, guys, we give you a completely new chapter, a new product, and we also give you a new logo, and we give you a new organization to look after our product. And it's not longer Nature Monuments, but Nature Experiments. And it's not protecting nature in the Netherlands, it's about designing nature in the Netherlands. So again, from nature conservation to nature activation. Right, I think that was more than long enough. Sorry to take all your time, but thanks for being with me.
That was great, Eelco. Thank you so much. Fascinating range of work and scales of work. And I'm just wondering, do people want to come in, and actually, if you stop sharing, then we can see.
Yes, I will. Sorry.
No, it's totally
Do
fine.
anything? You already done it?
No, you need to click the little white box with the X in it beside the leave symbol there.
That's it. Yeah.
Wonderful. So thank you so much. And I'm just wondering, I mean, people can unmute or they can leave questions in the chat, and I can read them out if they prefer.
It's nice to hear voices, of course. It's a weird virtual world.
Well, there is that thing that Teams do. I mean, Teams is particularly surreal, isn't it? Because when you present Eelco, we all disappear, and you could just be talking to yourself in your house.
The best thing in lockdown, the ones which I really had a big smile on my face. I mean, you guys must know that this lawyer in America who turns into a cat. That was fantastic. That's surreal. That is the new fairy tale. That was fantastic. Made me happy.
I think we have our first question, so apologies.
Yes, okay.
Do you want to unmute? Oh, sorry, no, I'm sorry. I thought there was a video there. I just thought somebody was looking to ask a question, but you're not, Diego, are you? Apologies. So, Eelco, just on those projects, the projects, well, particularly now as you run towards the Budapest project and the Dutch project, there's a scale of endeavour there, which is sort of like the design is sort of an attitude, isn't it? And then that it's one that's continually reinformed at every stage of its realization, in the sense that there is a specific landing point, is there? It's an attitude and a direction of travel, but where it ends up, we don't know.
I mean, of course, architects, and especially the very good architects, I'm sure they do it in their way. But as a landscape architect, you are acutely aware that that you're writing chapters. You're writing chapter in a book. There's a chapter before you, and there will be a chapter after you. So you're handing over the baton. You know, you're kind of part of a process. And sometimes that means you like to kind of redirect or reinvent, but it is dealing with something and make it into something else, and it will have a life on its own. And even more so, I mean, you know, things has changed in my duration when I practice. You know, when I was educated in the Netherlands, it was all about creating very functional landscapes. It's a very controlled landscape. The whole Dutch landscape is super controlled. You know, everything is controlled. Otherwise, it wouldn't even be there. But even in Holland, they discovered now, you know, the unthinkable. Like in Holland, you know, you can take your finger out of the dike, in the hole in the dike, and let it flood again. Which was like, when I was a student, that would be like hard to talk about, but now it's happening, and nature comes back in. And as soon as you let nature back in, it's about dynamics, it's about gradients, it's about transformation, it's about time, and to do so, you need scale. And I cannot show you because it's still competitions, but at the moment we do some competitions in Milan, and Milan is very interesting as a city right now because they really have interesting ideas to create a completely landscape framework out of their old railway network systems, and of course you got Stefan Boeri making his vertical forest, and etc. So yeah, we really like to operate on the scale of the city, on the scale of the landscape. That's where we want to be. It's of course not easy, and you straight away talk about politics. To be very cynical, is that China, which got a kind of political system which is not correct. You know, there's not what we think about democracy and a way of how to organize our society, but because they're organized that way, they actually can now work on landscape on a very big scale, and they do. So actually some of the very interesting landscape projects are taking place in China right now, just because of the scale, both the scale of the problems, but also the scale of operation. And the idea is that there's one government, one landowner, and therefore you can intervene on the big scale.
We've got a question here from Enrico. Enrico, do you want to unmute?
Yeah, sure.
Hi.
Good evening,
Hi there.
and thank you very much for the lecture. Very, very nice and inspiring. I have a question regarding the first part when you showed that really nice image with the architect leaning towards the building and then the landscape architect against the wall and the planting.
Yeah.
I just wonder basically how do you think it's still relevant, that picture of the landscape architect today? I mean, it's interesting that you presented that picture as a younger yourself. I just wonder basically how relevant is that of our profession today after all the projects that you've presented.
I have to make some confessions, and I have to be careful. We work a lot with architects. They are our friends. They are, and at the moment we work a lot with Diller Scofidio. We done a lot with Zaha Hadid. We work with Grimshaw. We work with Amanda Lavid, John McCaslin. The whole circus of architects. And I promise you, on a daily basis, I swear and shout and promise myself never ever to do it again, which means collaborating with architects. It's still, we're not making any progress here. In fact, we're going backwards. So no, architect. But I'm not the kind of sulky little boy crying in the corner. No, landscape architects, and I presume you are landscape architects or aspire to be one. We have to be assertive. We have to be out there and talk about it and claim our territory. But it doesn't come automatically. I have to, on a daily basis, explain what I'm doing. Architects don't understand the scale and the magnitude of our operations. And that's regardless of they are very good or very bad architects. And architects always trying to nearly always use the same scale as the interior of the building and use it as the scale of the exterior, etc., etc. So no, I'm actually I'm not negative because that's my profession. But I have to convince, and it's not getting better. I mean, it's not. I cannot say that it's now different. What is different is that when I started, I came from Holland, and I was quite young when I came to United Kingdom because to teach at the School of Art. That my profession was very much behind in this country. There was no landscape architecture of great merit in the early 1990s, and that has changed. I can now truly say that there's a range of really good and inspiring colleagues, architects, and some also really good, trendy, new, young ones. So that has changed. So we have done a lot of catching up. But architects, no, we have to fight them, and but in a friendly fight, Yeah.
Maybe that change of a relationship needs to start from education.
Oh, absolutely, and Andrew said it, and the great tribute to Mary Johnson, because she was head of architecture and landscape, and the fact that you are one department with these two-headed monsters. That's also why I love to teach in Harvard. So when I was teaching in Harvard, my studios, they were optional studios. So that means anybody in the student population has to select which optional studio they do. And I was always pleased and happily pleased that I attracted at least 50% of my students were architects. And quite frankly, architects are often better. They're better in drawing. They're often more clearer in thinking. So in that sense, I love architects. And then I love to teach them, because then to open their eyes that you can work outside the boundary of your product, that you can think about time, that you can be inspired by painting and all those things. I love, in that sense, I love to teach architects. I think it's a really nice, because they're open to that, of course. And of course, I'm batting around a bit, but I've done teaching, and I've done also work with people like Peter Cook. When I was a student, they were my heroes. Archigram, 1960s, really cool stuff. They're still around, and so they're of course really great architects doing great things. But I always think and of course we're both designers, so we have a lot of overlap. But I think what is important that landscape architects still understand natural systems, they understand vegetation, they understand soils, they understand landform. There are not many architects who understand landform these days. So we have something to add to the team, but none of the work you can do these days without teams. So it's only very rare these days I do a project on my own. I always work as part of teams of architects, landscape architects, lighting designers, traffic engineers, and that's fine. That's the way. And then you have to find your own niche in the market and your own little way of how you conduct yourself. But it's teamwork for sure.
Christoph, you wanted to come in there.
Yes, actually, I on one hand, I wanted to, first of all, I would like to express my sorrow over the fact that we're not there together at Kingston, because as usual, register lectures run at the end of it. We just relocate to a local venue and have a beer. And I'm not sure how you feel about beer, but that would be, I have some questions which actually should be asked over beer, like whether you have been in Pope's Grotto at all, or whether you know those kind of North English artificial ash mounds where we're recreated. But this is not for now. Actually, what I wanted to say that Mary was such a supporter of landscape architecture, and I always put this down to the fact that she was American and she learned to appreciate landscape architecture where the profession is much stronger. And I was wondering, actually, follow up on Enrico's questions, what are your experiences in terms of teaching landscape architecture? What is the professional standing in a way between the two countries, you having taught in both countries?
Well, first of all, like if you talking about standing, there's always a very, very big interchange between, especially United Kingdom, but not only, and what happens in America. And if you take Harvard, that's the oldest school of landscape there is. So that school of landscape architecture, I think it dates back from 1906 with Eliot, who was the first professor in landscape there. That is long before then any landscape schools of landscape started to appear in Europe. Like, most of the landscape schools in Europe are post-war. So that it was a really interesting head start in America, especially in Harvard. And then, of course, the big change came, which I definitely felt in Harvard, is that after, during the war, when a lot of the, especially Jewish immigrants, architects, landscape architects as well, started to move to find a safe haven, especially in New England and in Harvard, and became influential there, and then really started to bring a sense of modernism. And then it really started to kickstart in a very interesting way. And then you got people like Halprin and Akpo. And so America has been very interesting. But it's always, interchange. Field operations was, one of the bigger contemporary landscape architects in America, but run ultimately by a person, James Corner, who is English. He's as English as you can make it. So I'm a great believer of exchange. Again, if I'm teaching in Harvard, half of my students always have been from abroad. So it's international. And that's the way it should be. But it is true that there are some interesting. You're always looking for what are the key projects, and you have to admit that the Highline, for example, which was done as a purely collaborative project between field operation, Diller Scofidio, and Pete Oudolf, and some of those people I work with and presented them today as well in different formats. And again, those projects are happening in America, and the Highline is a private initiative. It's not a public project. It's not a city project. It's a trust. It's organized by people and initiated and run as a trust. And so there are new ways to create public landscapes in what maybe in a country which is normally much less public driven as we would expect compared to Europe. So interesting. So, but always keep your eyes open. I already talked about China, really good things happening in China. Turan landscape, one of the best landscape architects are now in China. So things are on the move. But I enjoyed to be in America as much as I enjoyed to be here at the School of Art. Were the students any better? No. I think students are students. They're always good and weak. And for me, it's important to, and that's, I nearly did actually change my lecture, but I decided not to do it, to talk about education because of Mary Johnson passing away and pay some tribute about teaching. But I always like for example, when I was teaching in Harvard, which was all about trendy landscape urbanism and all this kind of jargonesque pseudo-intellectual stuff, I just took my students to Walden Pond and did experiments in the ponds and took them swimming and went at 5 o'clock in the morning to see the mist rising in the ponds and spent the night there with the students, because to show them that the real landscapes are real things and real experience, and so I played the underdog there. So it's quite funny. So I never really went into this kind of landscape urbanism. I went very much more into the nitty-gritty of bringing students to real landscapes and do real products in real situations. So you always adapt, and I always like to be a bit like a provocateur, but you have to work with your territory. And you in Kingston, I know it quite well in the sense that we done Kew Garden masterplan, we done the you got the green grid in London, and we done the Arcadian landscape grid, so the whole landscape around your university along the Arcadian Thames. And when I was professor at the ETH in Zurich, I done as my studio project actually the Arcadian Thames as well. So I think you background is the cradle of the British landscape architecture. There is such a fantastic from history and layers of history. So it's a great, and I found that important. So if I was teaching in Kingston, which I don't, then I definitely would make use of the landscape next door to the university. You have to work with there to really to teach students not in the abstract but in the reality. And you guys in Kingston actually are pretty well situated.
Yes, actually, Kew Gardens are or planting design sandpit, so we do go there regularly. And of course, I know where the Arcadian Thames project as well. We are involved as a university in it too. So yeah, we are doing it.
Right.
What I've decided when this whole nightmare is over, I'm really keen to take students up to Richmond Hill and look at that thing, which is
well, exactly. It's one of those moments,
Yeah, absolutely.
Richmond Hill, and the idea that people literally were reading that landscape from there and viewing back all the way to St. Paul's, etc. Not just as it's a sideline. No, these were conscious kind of mapping and occupying territory. Again, fascinating to see the transformation of. I mean, often if we're talking about gardens in isolation or history in isolation, but it's the amalgamation. And in this case, like Kew is a World Heritage Site. Well, that's a dead duck. But the whole of the Arcadian Thames, that actually should have a specific status to recognize the kind of accumulation of this designed landscape over a prolonged period of time.
Absolutely.
And just a quick thing about history, although you didn't ask, I just say it anyway. I'm a great believer in history because, in the sense that we have to know the beauty and the inspiration of the past, and in order to be very contemporary, we have to understand the past. So I would never be reactionary or conservative if I'm talking about my products, but I still think understanding the history is super super much important of what we're doing. It's the kind of benchmark of which we doing our interventions.
There's a question here from Ezdan Eelco. I'm not sure if you want to unmute or do you want me to ask it? I'll happily ask it.
I don't really mind. I could ask as well. I was just
nice to have. Yeah.
So I was just wondering if I don't mind if it's personal or not, but do you think there's a connection between the human body and landscape architecture that goes behind just a scale? Like, is there kind of like anthropomorphism? Is there like a connection? Because I just recently got interested in landscape architecture, but it's quite a broad topic and a bit different from architecture that's just focused on a building that creates space that is often closed.
Well, I think the answer is very obviously yes, because the body and the whole way of how the body acts as a census of the environment, and also the fact that we cannot isolate ourselves from the environment. So if we are somewhere, we also influencing it by being there. So and again, I'm not on my own. There's many studies recently done about walking and all that kind of way of the bodily experience of landscape. And for me, it's very much to do with movement. Now, again, architecture is the same. I don't think that architecture is less of a bodily experience than landscape. I think it's equally so, if even more so. And of course, like Le Corbusier with his architectural promenade, which was already very cinematic. So I'm very much interested, maybe not so much in the body as a kind of morphological thing, but more as a kind of the way that we move through space. I mean, one of the famous trick of the good old picturesque landscape architects is that you would never, the line of your eyes should never follow the line of the path. So it's a kind of clever way of how you're positioning yourself. And I like these things. I talked about filmmaking, and if you look to the techniques of filmmaking, like depth of field or mise en scène or the way of montage, the way why they put the cut, it's very spatial in terms of third dimension and sense of movement, like music is as well. So yes, obviously it's. And there's maybe a different aspect is that, a good architect, I presume, would love to build his own house, not only design his house, but build his house. And, we landscape architects, I like to build landscapes, I walk in my garden, proudly so, so it's also a kind of physicality about digging and planting and raking and, engaging yourself in the landscape as well. So there are different ways of talking about body and landscape, I guess, in many different ways. And it's very sensual and sometimes even erotic. Landscape can be very erotic. So there is all of that aspect to it. And if you would take that out, it would be a very boring and very uninteresting landscape. So no, you're absolutely right to study the body and the landscape as integral.
And Mike, sorry, sorry, apologies, I cut across you.
Oh, no, I just wanted to say thank you very much. That's a good answer. Thank you.
Michael Herman, do you want to come in?
Hello there. Yes, thank you very much for the talk. It was really inspirational, and it was nice to hear you mention the at least one project including rewilding and the idea of allowing nature just to come in and do its own thing, as well as your the moving the forest business as well, which was extraordinary. I was curious actually just about that. Is that, in my experience, sort of big urban regeneration project in the Earth Centre in the Midlands in England many years back, when we were really relying more on natural, plants that came naturally and just leaving them to do their own thing rather than trying to move them. it was actually makes sense to uproot such large sort of trees and move them rather than to have.
Well, I mean, by the way, that project at the moment is on a political stalemate. Like all big projects are so difficult. You know, we worked on Tempelhof, that became on grounding halt. You talked about the Earth Center, that became a bit like a white elephant in terms of the Millennium projects. So all those projects are additionally complicated because they are large scale. The thing about the moving forest, that was not just an edifix. The mountain of which this forest had naturally colonized had to be moved. That was the exercise in the project. So if we would not try to replant the forest would be cut down and lost. Now, the fact that those trees were growing in this kind of spoil heap actually meant that they were quite shallow rooted. So it's actually quite a nice coincidence, good conditions to transplant them, because the root balls never really had kind of developed in a similar way if they were standing in proper soil. So again, that was interesting in that particular project. But the same kind when I talked about Heathrow, and I know Heathrow is controversial in terms of landscape, but I promise you, one of the people we brought into the project, his name is Henrik Sjöman, and he's from Sweden. He's from the Botanic Garden in Gothenburg, and he is the kind of guy. You look him up. He's Mr. Guy about tree planting and climate change. So we really started to operate with some really interesting people and trying, how can we create a completely new regional landscape and use local provenance. The trees, if we want to create a landscape with hundreds and hundreds of thousands of trees we have in mind, we have to build our own industry to deliver those plants if we want to have them not imported from Europe, but from local stock and local provenance. And again, how can we reseed and collect seeds and all of that is getting quite interesting. And one of the things, like it or not, is that if they would build the new, which of course now all quiet, but when nobody thought about if they kind of rebuilt the new runway. And what they will demolish on existing landscape is an incredible amount of mature trees would have been lost. And again, we've done a lot of work and convincing people of how we could rescue those trees and reutilize and replant them. So this idea that landscape is a big project and nearly kind of engineering project, making things, doing things, transplanting things. Yes, it's kind of, it's as old as the world. What do you think Capability Brown was doing when he was creating landscapes, or Le Notre in Versailles? These were big operations, and that is landscape. Landscape is not Chelsea Garden show or whatever. It's the big, nearly engineering type of scale of dealing with land and trees, and it's exciting. But like we discussed today, and I think what is interesting about, to give an example, we done this project in Germany, Tempelhof, and I'm always a provocateur. I'm always like to not upset people, but I like to raise debate. And if you, for example, go to Germany, all this fantastic, I use the word ecological Taliban, they're so hardcore in terms of their ecological beliefs. But if you really go dig into that, then, Adolf Hitler and the Nazis, they were the first people about nature protection, because it was about presenting the German natural landscape with native trees, and every kind of non-native trees should be roused, like the Jewish people should be be erased. So then suddenly it becomes very close to the bone, because then suddenly ecology becomes related to homeland, relates to in this case racial policies in a way of how we're dealing with native plants, it's very, very problematic. So in that sense, and I have a lot of those discussions also with Liz Diller from Diller Scofidio on a kind of highly academic level, to embrace this idea about plants are on the move. We cannot talk about native plants. We don't have the sole right to say this is British, so this is German. And the plants will be moving. They will have to move. Like we have people from Africa trying to enter Europe. Plants are moving as well. It's a kind of global way. In a funny way, you can make links parallels between that. And I'm not talking here about good or bad, or not even talking about positions, but I'm talking about the kind of curiosity of all of that, and the fact that we have to talk about this. So when I'm saying about I'm against nature conservation and I'm in favor of nature activation, that is quite a statement. It's a statement which actually sometimes put me in awkward positions. But I truly believe it. We can create nature. Nature, that's why I showed you the Darwin project. We can create, so we also can be optimistic about it as well. We can make things. And that's why I'm also not too worried to undertake a project like Heathrow Airport, because I think we can make a difference. If we do it with the right intent, we can make a difference by being creative and clever and intelligent.
Thanks very much, Eelco. What we might that was a very nice way maybe to wrap up on an optimistic note about our capacities to deal with these complicated and nuanced problems. And maybe that's an interesting one to kind of close on, which is your point about teamwork and the point about collaboration. And I think that I find actually it's an interesting one to say it, but I find those old binaries. They exist also between interiors and architecture, and supposedly between architecture and landscape. I wonder, is that also generational in the sense that, and maybe I'm wrong about that, but there's so many different expertise involved in anything of any scale now, easily 20 or 30 different disciplines, and the teamwork is sort of implied, otherwise nothing can happen. It's an interesting one. It's an interesting provocation to leave with, though, which is that your experience of these architects that you're naming is one of resistance of that kind of collaboration, which is disappointing, to say the least.
Yeah, well, to say there's another thing is with this intriguingly, and just to add to the complexity of it, but if you take our profession, my profession of landscape, it used to be extremely regional defined. I got the questions about what do you think about teaching in America and what's the difference in Europe, and then started to say, well, it's getting very intermixed. But take 10 years ago, 20 years ago, or when I was a student about 30 years ago, the Danish landscape was really defined. It was about ovals and little things, and the Germans always were about ecology, and the French were never drawing. They were just talking about the palm zest, and the Brits always were more about horticulture. And it was really defined, and the Dutch were creating their own landscape. They thought they were God on earth, and they were making the land. We're really, really regionally different, and I feel still different because I'm from Holland. I come from this world of making the landscape and thinking about concepts and and okay, but of course that is changing very, very quickly. I mean, I sometimes call ourselves the children of the Google Earth revolution. We googling, we talking about all those international projects, but it's actually against the natural grain of my profession, because you really have to understand a site, a climate, a culture in order to operate. And it is true. I mean, even I should not say it openly, but it is true. If I work with Zaha Hadid, and if we're working in China or in the Middle East or in Sweden, quite frankly, the buildings are looking very much the same, regardless where they are being used, which actually makes them also very interesting, because they make them very resilient and very powerful as objects, or as why not? But it is different from my profession. It's because we're working with living material. We have to be having a sense of place and a sense of culture, even if it's contemporary culture, and even if culture means sometimes non-culture, like wasteland or in between land or derelict land. but we always have real sites. We cannot just parachute a project down. Hence, also very weird for me to operate my profession in lockdown. It's really, really weird.
I think we're all shared in that feeling of weirdness. Eelco, thank you so much.
Thanks for asking me, and keep it going. And I would love to have been there physically and the Grafton building and go for a beer, etc. But for sure, time will come, for sure.
Thank you so much for your time and your generosity, and thanks all. Join us next week, Wednesday morning, 9:30, when Kate Goodwin.
Yeah, you got a good series. I keep my eye on it now. That's great.
Well, we'll be back in touch with you, Eelco, because there's a podcast interview which Christoph and I will be in touch with you about, but we'll do that. I'm a bit behind in getting them out, as people will know.
No problem.
Lockdown has...
I'm sure after I talk, you never want to work with me again.
Oh, no. It's in the bag. If you can be design team lead, Eelco.
Okay. We talk soon. Okay.
All the best.
Bye now. Thanks, guys. Bye. Bye.